Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Lordrusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. I'm Zandy, I'll be your host for this one. This prompt is about demos for games. What stuff of the game's various options the game starts you off with. If it's going to give you various, classes or playstyles to choose from, which ones do you start off with, and what effect does that have? How might you decide which ones to start out with? Lordrusty begins. This month I've played a couple new games with very different approaches to demos. Tactical Breach Wizards and Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. Tactical Breach Wizards is a turn-based tactics puzzle thing. Think XCOM or Into the Breach, but with set puzzles rather than randomly generated encounters. And Deep Rock Galactic Survivor is a bullet heaven. Vampire Survivors like bullet hell. There are lots of projectiles, but they're yours. Bullet heaven game set in the Deep Rock universe with the same voices for the classes as Deep Rock Galactic. The Scout, Gunner, Engineer, and Driller have the same voices as from Deep Rock Galactic. Both have pretty heavy theming, and I've really liked both. Breach Wizards a lot more than Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. Breach Wizards is currently your frontrunner for Game of the Year, but the games themselves were excellent. That said, we're not here to talk about whether they're good games. I want to talk about starting characters and what they say about the game you're making. We've talked a little bit about default characters in the main character energy / be an NPC parlay I sent a while back, but I think picking the wrong / starting or default class for a game can really ruin tone. Cool. Yeah, I definitely agree. Let's start with Deep Rock Galactic Survivors as a example. I actually just so happen to have experienced this same thing with Deep Rock Galactic Survivors. Lordrusty continues, Deep Rock Galactic Survivor's unique selling point is that on top of the normal bullet heaven stuff, you can dig through walls. Yeah, a really good fit for this kind of game. You can funnel the hordes of enemies you often fight in these bullet heaveny games through little trenches that you dig, use them as escape routes to get away when you're cornered, etc. It's a really interesting addition to the genre. That was why I got the game, because I think that while it's obviously quite directly inspired by Deep Rock, by Deep Rock Galactic, by Vampire Survivors, there is a good game design reason for adding digging to Vampire Survivors. Like that would potentially be fun in Vampire Survivors, and so I thought, yeah, that could be good, And I played Deep Rock Galactic, and I thought if there are similar designers, which there may not be, that could be fun. I ought to have checked that, and I ought to have checked that. Let's get into it. There are resources inside the terrain as well, so it's a big part of the game. So the demo of the game includes the class with the least benefit from interacting with the terrain. Obviously, the Driller would have specific buffs to drilling, and Gunner and Engineer both have big downtime moments in their kit, which are best spent mining. Engineer has weapons that require them to stand still to deploy, which can happen while mining. If you're mining a rock and you haven't gotten through it, that counts as standing still for some weapons. And Gunner has long reload times, might as well mine. While Scout's main benefit is running fast and constant damage, he's the class most incentivized to mine a minimal amount and is closest to a standard bullet heaven style character. His guns are also the most straightforward. From a game dev standpoint, I understand making your default guy with gun fun first, and then making new classes, but particularly for a demo, I think picking a class which shows off your unique mechanics as much as possible makes more sense, like, say, Driller. The devs almost realized this too, it seems. Most of the starting items you unlock from chests before meta progression are like mine blank rock to gain X resource items, which push you toward digging more, but they're weakest on your starting class, Scout. There's also some weirdness where the starting class then swings back around to being interesting once you unlock more items and subclasses. I played the demo, thought, another Vampires clone, and didn't come back to it. I only ended up buying the game from word of mouth recommendation from my friends and a big sale on Steam. Maybe they wanted you to feel like you were progressing to stronger items and then find out when you unlock Driller that those items were strong all along, but it almost put me off the game. It sure put me off the game. I definitely had a similar experience. Yeah, there's a couple different things we can do here. Let's use this example to look at. It's not, I think that starting with Scout was the wrong choice looking at the situation as a whole. But there's a lot of about that. Well, I'm sure for some people it would have been the right choice, and we're just guessing what percentage of players that would be. Of course, so are the developers of Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. We're all just guessing how many players would prefer it to start one way or another. But if that's all we can do anyway, let's just like think about it. What maybe how could we reason that it would be more or less of a good starting point to start with something simpler, default guy with gun, more like Vampire Survivors, rather than like something weirder? We can still think about that. We're all just guessing, so we could talk a little bit about progression. This game may have some designs for you to experience the unlocks a certain way that may or may not work for various people. And of course, I can't know everyone's perspective. I know I really didn't like them. In fact, I think this is, for me, the game that I played this year, which had the worst progression for me. But I'm not necessarily convinced that that means it was bad in general, though I do have some thoughts where I do think it's bad in general, and not just that I disliked it. Um, and then yeah, like there's also this distinction between demo and the main game. Now, as far as I'm aware, Deep Rock Galactic Survivor's demo does start the same way as the game starts, but you could not do that. You could have the demo be not the beginning of the game. You could have it be a window into how the game is going to feel, but then when you start the game, you don't do that. You do something different. We could talk about that too. So let's talk about them all. First, a little bit of speculation. So what did they choose to do? Why do I think that is maybe not a good design choice? And then how do you decide? How did they decide, do we think? It seems to me, Lordrusty, that you're making a really straightforward, really well structured point about this game has this unique mechanic, but it gave you the familiar mechanic instead. And so we can look at there as being kind of two options to simplify the situation. We can give the player we can start the player on the unique gameplay slice or on the familiar gameplay slice. The familiar gameplay slice, you play Scout. It's more like other games like this. It's the least specific to this game, but the player is probably the most familiar with it. It sounds logical for various reasons. The player will feel comfortable and understand how to basically play the game if you start them with that option. Sure. But that's where I begin to see a lot of problems. I mean, in the first place, these types of games are not very complicated to operate. Your weapons fire automatically, you just move, and when you move into terrain, you mine it. There are almost no controls, and there isn't necessarily too much finesse early on in how you set up your run. It's pretty much just the order in which you take item upgrades in. So already, I don't think we're dealing with a game that really wants an easy tutorial where you really need to decomplicate everything. You know what I mean? At the same time, the biggest amount of complexity in many of these games is in their upgrades. And well, you don't start with many of those unlocked. And so that already is decomplicated, if you will. Even if we start the player with the unique option instead of the familiar option, we start the player on Driller, well, the most complicated part of the game, the item unlocks, is still simplified heavily. So I'm not sure there's really a benefit in terms of making things simple. There's not a big benefit anyway. And again, obviously there will, no matter what we do, there will always be a human on Earth for whom starting with the simpler approach would be more to their preference. And not to be, no offense to that person, that's fine. It doesn't matter from a game design perspective because we can't know for sure. The best we can do is say, will our target audience or most players or most of the potential market or whatever you want to specify, will the multiplicity of the players that we are trying to make the game fun for prefer it this way or that way? And so it doesn't matter if some people would prefer it this way or that way. What matters is what more of the people we want to like the game would enjoy. That might actually be a smaller group of people, sure, but whatever. Let's assume it's people who want a riff on Vampire Survivors and like Deep Rock Galactic. That audience. Would anywhere near most of those people need a simple intro to this game's design? And I would say emphatically, no. The game is called Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. The idea of the game assuming the player isn't familiar with Vampire Survivors gameplay and the only other thing that's different, which is digging through walls. But at the same time, the game is quite literally called Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. Doesn't, no, like those things don't, those clash as ideas. That doesn't, you cannot hold both to be true. You'd think the player wouldn't be familiar with the game that you named something that is literally exactly the games you think they are familiar with. Like those are not, those don't compute. So that's why I would argue, regardless of how I feel, it is kind of just illogical for the game to start with a simpler character. It's not crazy. It's not bereft of value, but I don't think it is a choice that makes much sense. It's not a very good guess, in my opinion. And we can't ever know for sure, of course, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were a lot of people who were put off it this way. I actually want to go a little bit further with this though. Let's dig a little deeper for why they did it though. And a lot of these things will be things that these specific developers may very well not have thought, but again, other games do this. You know, there's plenty of other games in this situation. Why do they do it this way instead? And I think there are some not good logical reasons, but like things that make sense going on. And I just think that's interesting. And I would hate for, I emphatically argue that this is not a good way for the game to start. Sort of in some way objectively, this is sort of the wrong way for the game to start. Yes. But I would hate for it to seem like I'm saying, well, you're such an idiot for picking it this way. No, not at all. I actually think it's perfectly sensible, totally understandable, just not very good game design. Because that's hard to do that, for it to start this way. It's no offense, I suppose. Quite the opposite. I actually have a lot of respect for shipping a game at all, and these ideas are going to be about that. You can't just be an unfeeling robot. It's your game that you're making, right? And so one of the things is that I think the conservative approach just feels safer. Imagine your emotions as you're publishing a game. I mean, it's a Vampire Survivors clone, but you've caught the bug. You want to dig while playing Vampire Survivors. And I perfectly well believe that developers of this game thought digging while playing Vampire Survivors is fun. Hell yeah. You know, I get it. That's why I bought it. Fair enough. You know, I don't think this game is like taking the piss or a lazy adaptation of the idea necessarily. I don't think it's the highest effort adaptation, sure. But you know, like it's a reasonable idea. There's no harm, no foul there. So it's kind of scary, right? People are going to be a bit judgmental. Like this is like all those other games, right? Now, unfortunately, the conservative or shy approach here made it look even more like those other games. So that's not really a win. But I definitely get that putting yourself out there that way and saying, here's the weirdest part of the game. That's the first thing we show people. I hope they like it. Yeah, you can see why you'd hesitate to do that if there were more reasons not to do it, which there are. For another example, players are very, very patient nowadays. Now, I here am going to make a more personal argument, or this one is kind of tricky. I don't think they really should be. I think a lot of players they're in the habit of being patient through the beginning of a game's unlocks. They're in the habit of the game being kind of boring at first. And you'll hear people say things like, oh, 10 hours in, it gets good. 10 hours. You can watch 10 hours. You can play some serious games in 10 hours. You can watch every movie by a director you like. Several entire life-changingly beautiful anime. I don't know. You go live your life a little bit. Have an unforgettable day out. 10 hours. That's not an okay amount of time for a game to not be fun. But people are very tolerant to this nowadays. Not everybody, of course, but lots of people are. And other types of media do heavily use the beginning of their runtime as a kind of buffer for exposition or whatever they need to get done, really. It's really common with books, for example, for the beginning of the book to be, a slower start. There's a couple of things there, though. I mean, books are not 10 hours a lot of the time. Some of them are, but, 10 hours to get exciting. There are very few books that are like that, yeah? A lot of it will be the first couple chapters. Perhaps a half hour will be a little slow, okay? It's a book. You're sitting down in a leisurely environment doing almost nothing physically. Your brain is working a lot, sure, and reading. The vibe of sitting down to read for many people, yeah, it's okay for it to start a little slower. But even then, in terms of its total length, many books really don't take their time too much. They just put whatever little time they do take, yes, they do put it at the beginning. So I think a lot of pieces of media that do spend the beginning of the game kind of setting something up, the beginning of their runtime, whatever it is, if they're not a game, yes, they do spend that time at the beginning, but it's a shorter percentage of the total time you're playing. You also don't have to do anything physically during that time, so it's not boring in the same way. You don't have to repeat an action over and over again. Now, this is subjective in a way. Some players repeating the same action over and over again, that makes them less bored. Me, it makes me more bored, and I know I'm not alone, and neither are those other players. That's a toss-up, sure. And again, we and the developers of Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, we can't know which group is bigger. We just have to make the educated guess that we can, and acknowledge that we're going to be influenced by our emotions too, of course. So there are some of these points where we might say, we'll just throw that out. We're aware that's there. If we could find a way to know more certainly how many players kind of feel this way or that way, that could be useful. But if we can't quickly, let's just move on because we have plenty of things to weigh. Sure, absolutely. So some players, I think a lot of players, will find needing to actually do a thing over and over again while waiting for the game to get good to be even more onerous. Sure, but I just don't see an easy way to decide like roughly how many players that would be, so whatever, don't worry about it. It doesn't have to be perfect. But furthermore, I just think that for video games, there are a lot of games out there competing for your attention in a way that when you read a book, you do not launch your, well, maybe you do actually if you use an ebook reader, but you do not launch into your book always through a platform where you can see the games you could be playing instead right there. I do think that for better or for worse, video games have become a pretty competitive medium to consume. And people drop games a lot. And I don't think that's bad. I just feel like a lot of people drop games because the game wasn't well targeted to them. The game didn't market well to them. The game's beginning wasn't structured well for them. They wanted to enjoy it, but didn't. It was a good idea for them to buy the game, but the game wasn't structured with a good idea. And so they were lost, when in fact they could have gotten a lot of fun out of that game. I just think that's not good. It's not the end of the world, it's not a crime, but it's bad, if we had to say. So all these things put together, you can see there are some factors that not really good reasons as per se, but sensible cause and effect for why you would make the beginning of the game kind of undo itself a little bit, I would predict. And again, I don't know for sure. For all I know, it would be worse if we did it my way, even though there's a good reason to think it wouldn't be, a lot of good reasons to think it wouldn't be. And there's lots of things that complicate this situation. Were we to change timelines and go to a timeline where I made Deep Rock Galactic Survivor start with Gunner, or Driller, or Engineer, which is what I'd want to start it with, somehow, and then we saw how the sales did, it would be misguided to say the game sold more, therefore Zandy was right. I don't know. I mean, the players that will take the time to critique your game in a 45-minute long parlay, or, you know, a review on Steam, are going to be the players who have the time to realize that the beginning of the game was a bit slow. Does them calling that out, does us calling that out, really mean it was that bad of a decision? Or is it just that, of course, of all humans, the people that do not prefer the beginning to start out like this, of course, are gonna be the people that will point it out. The kind of person who would not want the beginning to be slow because they're familiar with games is the kind of person who would know how to explain that they didn't like that. And therefore you're going to hear that feedback more, but that's just because the people who don't like it know how to explain what they don't like. They just happen, that just happens to be who those people are. And for all we know, we're like 1% of the people playing the game. Of course. At the same time, again, I think the strongest point is that it seems like other people making Deep Rock Galactic Survivors banked quite heavily on people being familiar with this game. Hence, you know, naming it Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. And yet the game acts like you've never played, hey, I hate to be blunt, but a video game before, let alone a game like this or like that. And I just feel like that with the information we have, I feel like it's a fairly safer than usual bet to assume that it would have been better to start with not Scout. There's a note in here I thought was really interesting. Lordrusty put in parentheses, and I skipped over it when I was reading before. I know you're going to want to use this as a jumping point off for all Buildcraft games should have an unlock all button tangent, Zandy. It's another case where such a button would alleviate some pain points, but we're going to accept the constraints that we're stuck with meta progression for this parlay, one problem at a time. Of course we are. I mean, it's perfectly valid to have progression in your game. If I gave you the impression that I think all games with meaningful build systems should have an unlock all button, I don't necessarily think that. If I said it before, my feelings are changing quickly. This is a fairly new idea for me. Just the past, 6 months or so, maybe. I don't necessarily think that's that good of an idea here. Now, what I do think is interesting, going on to our next example, is that I have played a number of games that do kind of halfway. No unlock all, but they don't start you with one class option. They start you with 2 or 4. And here you can see what seems like a really easy solution to our conundrum here. How do we choose which one to guess that the player would enjoy starting with, the unique option or the familiar option? Well, what if we give them both and then just have them pick? And then the players who would prefer to start with the unique option will start with them, and players who want to start with the familiar option will start with it. Problem solved, right? Well, on a progression level, you're not exactly giving up a lot of progression points. Here, you're not giving the player unlock all. The player still has 90% of the progression they would have had. You're sacrificing just one piece for this. Now, you could argue in Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, well, there are only 4 classes, or at least as far as I know, there are only 4 classes, because I didn't get that far. And so you are giving up 2 of the 4 instead of 1 of the 4 at the beginning, but you're not giving them up. I also feel like people are a little obsessed with more unlocks rather than things like pacing or just better gameplay or progression, like difficulty progression, rather than unlocks. And again, here, this is something where we need to be careful not to get overly hung up on my preference. My preference, yes, actually probably would be to just unlock all in most games, but that's not game design. That's just what I personally want. There are plenty of games that have plenty good reasons for not unlocking all, and that counts. Who cares that I want to unlock all in those games? However, that doesn't mean that it's true that we, again, somehow know that those games need every bit of progression they have. I would still argue that a lot of developers are a little bit overly fixated on giving the player like the most progression. We've talked a lot in the past about how current developers don't seem to see the negatives to providing progression. They think unlocking build options is a 100% upside. There are no downsides, and that's obviously wrong. It doesn't mean you should care about those downsides necessarily, but there obviously are downsides, practically always. And therefore, I think it's not so bad to suggest just give the player 2 options from the start. Now, it's still not that simple. You need to make sure that both options are a starting point that provides compelling progression. For example, in Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, you start with Scout, and then you get more and more drilling focused, if you like, as you unlock the other classes. Well, how does the progression feel if you start with Driller? Well, I think it would probably be fine. You go Driller and then, let's say, Scout next. You have Scout unlocked by default. Maybe you can pick which one you unlock by default, but anyway, let's say you have Scout unlocked by default too, so you play Scout next. Now you get the biggest contrast between drilling and not so much focus on drilling. And you get to see how that's valuable, but it's still like a Vampire Survivors game, so you can not drill as much if you want to. I don't think that's bad. We don't need to go into too much detail, but just to gesture at the idea that for multiple starting points to work well, you would need to think about the player's progression and experience of the game multiple times. That is certainly more work, though I think it's hardly insurmountable. And to be blunt, I think a lot of games really ought to put in the work to think through how the player will experience them with the one progression system they have as well. And so having 2 is just more of an invitation to do that work that would improve a lot of games a lot. But I do think that there is a kind of final problem, at least as I see it for now, which is that the player needs to know that those options are the unique and the familiar option. Now, you can do this a few ways. I mean, something that I thought of was, well, the game is called Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. How about the survivor that is more like vampire survivors, Scout in this case, has something that is kind of a reference to vampire survivors in the description, or if it wasn't a game like Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, you could imagine the character could just like be a Castlevania looking guy, and then the player might go, oh, that's the one that's like Castlevania. You know, you could do it in a subtle way. I will say, as I basically always say at this point in the discussion, I still haven't been presented with any good reason why the developer ought not to just tell the player directly, type in the game, this is the one that's more familiar if you've played games like this. This is the one that's less familiar. This is done in some games. We booted up when we were playing Darkest Dungeon. There's a big splash thing that says, this is a hardcore tactical roguelike or whatever. And so you should expect to struggle and die, and you're going to die and come back, and it's fine. And that's the kind of game it is. Make it the best of a bad situation. This is not immersive. You know, the developer literally just writes, this is the kind of game it is. Hey, player, not in character, this is the type of game it is. I'm not saying that this has no downsides. Immersion is good, sure. But it's a lot of games behave as if you like can't do this, like as if you, the developer, can't just say to the player, "Hey, this is how this works. Have fun. Like, just do that." There like a good 60% of problems we've talked about on the stream and in Parley would be solved if the developer was willing to just do that. Again, unless there's something I'm not seeing. Whenever you've gotten literally zero counterpoints to an idea, I personally philosophically think that's a bad sign. There probably is a reason, I just don't know yet why developers are not doing that. That is outside, like it's not because of immersion, it's not because they haven't thought of it. There's something stopping a significant number of developers from doing this, and I just don't know what it is yet. I maybe not, but I bet there is. Anyway, it's definitely worth considering if there's some problem I don't know about. I mean, make sure it's there if you're not going to do this, because otherwise that would solve it. If you label Scout, hey, this is the one that's more like games like this, and you label Driller, this is the one that's more like this game, like which experience do you want? I mean, that would solve it right there, unless there's some other problem. So, you know, uh, but I do think making the player aware of which option is which would help. I have myself played a few games that are Vampire Survivors like games that start you with multiple options, where some of the options are more typical of the genre, if you want to call it that, and some of them are more weird and specific to this game, but the game doesn't give you any indication of which is which, and I only now know which is which after having played all of them. Like, I just had to figure it out myself, which largely defeated the point of giving me multiple starting points. If I just have to figure out which one myself, I mean, it would be nice if the game, like, I don't know, gave me a suggestion or something. I don't know. I don't think that's that weird. Is this that extreme of an idea? I hate to be like this. I hate to say, you know, I think it's fairly obviously bad for this game to start this way, and there's a very simple solution that is extremely easy to implement. But it does appear to be that way to me. And as always, I want to finish by throwing a bone a little bit. Genuinely, these games are made on tight deadlines. Like, it's entirely possible, as it is with many things, that the developer's answer is, we just honestly didn't think of that. We don't have that perspective. We just didn't think of that. We agree with you. We would rather make it this way. And to that I say, well, the game is able to be patched, so you can make it that way. But anyway, let's move on to Tactical Breach Wizards as an example. Or contrasting this to Tactical Breach Wizards, which is the third installment of the Defenestration trilogy. Okay, the unique selling point for this game compared to XCOM is that movement-based attacks are often more effective than direct attacks. If you can get enemies through windows, and that you can rewind time to any point in your turn until you hit the end turn button. So movement-based attacks, you mean like knocking enemies back, off or out of things. There's probably pulling enemies closer to you. I have not played this one. So the game supports this selling point in the demo by including a character that does low damage and high knockback, and a time wizard who gives teammates extra turns and predicts enemy movement with Overwatch-style abilities. There are more straightforward characters you unlock later. The team rounds out with a tank who's very straightforward, a medic who's very interesting once they have their full build, but starts simple, and a shapeshifter who's pretty complex near the end. But the game didn't start with the simplest characters, it started with the ones that matched the themes. The demo was basically a slam dunk for me and left me salivating for the rest of the game. Right, and here you can see where doing it that way seems almost too obvious, which it could be a bad sign in and of itself, but it just makes sense. I mean, I like how you included too low damage and high knockback. The character that they're including resists your temptation to play the way you would play other games. Before we were trying to be critical but nice to Deep Rock Galactic Survivor's position, understanding why the game made what we may reasonably predict was perhaps the wrong overall decision for its demo. I argued, as best as I can see anyway, and tried to explain maybe why you would think about it that way anyway. There are some good reasons. It's not like ridiculous to have done the demo that way. I just feel like it would, when you look at it, be better overall to have done it a different way, sure. And it's just a guess. But here, a game doing it, I would argue, in a way that makes sense, or at least worked for you, Lordrusty, and you can hear some arguments for why. We can go a little further and see some more merits of this approach. One of them is that if you make a demo that has the characters that are more unique to your game, you unlock the potential fun that you might not have if you'd given the player access to the tools that are more like the game they're familiar with. For example, if you give the player Scout in Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, if it is possible in your game to get by playing Vampire Survivors, the player may do that if they're given the player that plays that way first. If it relatively works at first, and it does in Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, I can tell you from experience, the player may not dig. And that's okay if that's what they want to do, but they may not try to dig. They may not even try the different fun that this game's design is capable of. And that seems like a bit of a shame. I mean, it's not so bad, maybe, if you're going to start them with a weaker point anyway. Why not at least show them what the game has to offer? This is sometimes contentious with people. There's a bit of I'm going to be a little judgmental and call it a bit of a fetish in the gaming community for the game not revealing things about itself. But I personally think that unless you have a good reason why it would be really fun for the game to hold something like that back, it's better to try to make the game about inviting the player in. You know, if the game doesn't have a reason why it would uniquely think it would be fun to not tell the player playing this way would be fun, tell the player playing this way might be fun. It's not bad to show the player the content. So you can see here that the game is doing double duty. Not only does it start you with characters in Tactical Breach Wizards that knock enemies back, that play more into how the game is different from similar games, they also have characters that try to make you less assume that you can just play the game the same way. Let's say you strongly assume you can just play XCOM. Well, they gave you characters where that strategy will be a little weaker. That's okay. If the player likes games like XCOM, they will probably still like this unless they literally only like that other game, in which case you don't have to make your game for people that are not its target audience. If they really only like XCOM, it's okay for them to be turned off by your game that cannot be played the way XCOM can be and go do something else. Or, you know, you can even strike a balance where it's possible to win that way, but the player bears witness when they try to do that to how much easier it would have been to like knock an enemy out of a window or something. You don't have to outright prevent it. You can just show the player the benefit of doing the knock out the window thing. And that just sounds fun. I can easily imagine, not having played this demo, that you could allow the player to win the first fight or encounter, breach, by just doing damage, but it would be pretty easy to at least demonstrate the fun of knocking someone out a window, and I bet 95% of players would just happily knock the units out of the window. And a lot of people that wouldn't would just be interested in the game's design and say, okay, I wonder if you can win by not doing that. And they're gonna play the game. They're just fascinated by the constraints of the design. So that's perfectly fine too. I definitely think why the player tries to play a certain way is a useful motivation here. And you can see how this is a great example, just by the way. The teammates extra turns thing and the predicting enemy movements thing also sounds cool for a demo into this type of game, because it sounds like the concept for the game is, if you haven't played, XCOM or whatever, maybe this is a game where it's not like the Deep Rock Galactic Survivor example. I argued during that part of the parlay that the Survivors-like games, the controls, the way you operate the game are a bit too simple for it to be that necessary to give the player like the most streamlined one up front. I just don't think that's entirely necessary. But this is a game where that might not be entirely true. If you're primarily going to kill enemies by doing clever, somewhat thinking outside the box things, maybe giving the player a time wizard that gives teammates extra turns and predicts enemy movements with Overwatch style abilities is a good way to help invite them into that fantasy. Give them one of the game's stronger tools for doing that action first, and then hopefully as the game opens up, they'll get used to it on their own and they might consider switching off of that character, or they're good in their own way, they give teammates extra turns. That's a great mix. Predicting enemy movements might be a little bit less powerful as you get better at the game, but giving teammates extra turns might become more powerful as you become better at the game. So I feel like that character would balance really well. As you progress in the game, will those abilities kind of even out a little bit, keeping the character relevant but not feeling necessary? I have no idea, of course, but it looks like maybe, yeah, I think that's a useful thing too. This definitely demonstrates what could be a pitfall when doing this kind of thing. If you give the player the unique thing first, and that unique thing is good in your game, you might give them something they'll never swap off of first. I don't know that I would pick the character that gives you the most abilities to knock enemies out of windows right away, because you run some risk of the player just never not, using that character. Obviously, ideally, the characters would just be balanced anyway, but if it feels like the whole design is pointing to one thing, and then you give the player that first, they might stick to it a bit. This is not the end of the world. It might be that the benefits of giving them this demo starting point outweigh the detriment of a few players really getting stuck on those starting options because they feel like they really define how the game feels. But as long as you said you get a tank and a medic later, a shapeshifter, as long as these options are relatively tactically useful, it should be mostly fine. And then if a few players want to stay on them, that's obviously fine. You were not trying to prevent any possible human from having a bad experience, just going as far as we reasonably can. Sounds cool. It sounds like a good demo. You're selling it good to me. Maybe I'll play that. Lordrusty's question at the end: should more games have a default or starting class which focuses more on pushing the game's strengths rather than being simple and straightforward? Or is this something which you think would only work in an indie title where the audience can be assumed to have a higher video game literacy? If games are going to use a blank class as the default for the main game, is it still a good idea to use them in the demo? How many people does a bland default actually help into the game compared to how many people it pushes away? And of course, I had read this parlay before, so I largely already answered that throughout the parlay. But I think this is a good summary, and I've been trying to do summaries more in parlay. I think there are some further points to quickly wrap up here, though. Right. I like the point about the experience with the game industry. I think this can be a little tricky. One of my proclivities as a creator is that I don't like things to be dated. I don't like something to be temporal. I want to make something and have it be good in a way that endures. Not forever, not necessarily. And for me, it's not about the really common thing you'll hear where people say it's like my legacy. Like, I don't care at all about that. I'll die and I won't be aware if people still know about my videos, so that doesn't affect me. It doesn't matter. I don't really get that personally. However, I just feel like it's an inefficient use of time. I mean, for my life, while I am alive, I would like it if the things that I made in the past don't just become completely obsolete. I would like to at least say, I'm not as good at making videos now as I will be in 5 years. What can I make good enough now that it will be useful? And let me just make that now. And if I have something I think would be harder to make, how about I make it a little later instead? Doesn't mean I have to put it off forever. I could just say when I've got two options, maybe the one that's a little easier to make maybe I'll favor that by a little. And so I'm the kind of creator that would not want to make a game different because of what I perceive as being the kind of meta context for the game. Not to go on too long of a tangent, the reason I think that's relevant is this idea that you make the game have a different demo or start differently because it is an indie title where the audience can be assumed to have a higher video game literacy. That is, in our current situation, it makes total sense. But the game will eventually lose that context. It will eventually be older and simply people will just run into it. And you could argue that these people will still have higher video game literacy. Sure. But I would be inclined to try to make the game just kind of good in general. Or it would be really, really good if we could find something that is just broadly good. And then if that is on the side of assuming higher video game literacy, then like, great, happy accident, you know. The strongest design we can think of that happens to correlate with assuming higher video game literacy is what I would prefer, but that's just me as a creator. And I think it's a matter of opinion. You know, if people want to make their piece of art assume this or that about the audience, that's one thing. You know, that's where maybe I'm willing to say, well, do what you want to do as a creator. However, I feel like a lot of pieces take it just a bit too far. You know, if you're gonna make the player wait 10 hours for the game to get going, I would argue almost objectively, you need to just do something to at least make the player aware of where you're going with this, or make it seem reasonable to invest your time a little bit more. I'm not going to defend the practice of just hoping the player will tough it out for that much time. I feel like that's just bad. People often come at this point and say, well, you're just catering to people with bad attention spans nowadays. And I feel like that argument is a really overused slippery slope. I feel like there's not having the patience to wait through the first 30 seconds of a video, and there's having the discernment to not wait 10 hours for something to be fun. Those are simply not the same thing. A smart person will not tolerate things fucking about with their time. Like that's just normal. Like, and so yeah, of course you have to draw the line. But I think in many of these games, it's not even close to being a matter of a short attention span. It's hours and hours, you know, too long. So I would argue that I think the indie title thing is smart. You know, if the game is going to be played in a more niche arena, maybe you assume the higher video game literacy. But I would go on to suggest that that's more like the default. And it would be like the special thing is you only go for the simple option when the game is especially pushing to a mass market. The game is for people who are new to playing games. You know, then you make it the absolute simplest option right off the bat. Sure, okay. And that in general, you can assume a higher video game literacy. Going one notch up is probably going to be better on average. And if you're the exception, you probably know you're the exception. You have a 50-person marketing department, you're a AAA game, and you know that you're catering to an unusually new to video games audience. So sure, you know, make it an easier starting point. But I would argue that the more unique starting point is a superior default for many reasons we've talked about in this parlay. But again, that's just my reasoning at the moment. I'm sure there are reasons I don't see, and it is just a guess. It will only ever be just a guess. And so I don't know. I just think that's a good starting point. Now, I think a more interesting subject that we could get into a little bit more is like different forms of game. We touched on it a little bit with both the idea of giving the player multiple starting character options, and the demo doesn't have to be the same thing as the actual beginning of the game. I think this is an interesting topic, but a little separate, because we have to go into adapting games to the player that is playing them. A little bit outside, like, what does the starting point of the game decide to show the player? I would be very interested, if you're interested, in doing a whole other parlay that's about, like, how do you do multi-starting points? Because that's kind of more what Unlock All is as well, I would argue. It's not so much that it's a part of the game in my mind, as much as a release valve where you say, hey, I've played video games a lot, so the idea that unlocking everything right away would be overwhelming, that just doesn't overwhelm me. And you, the game designer, you know that that's why you put this in. That's why the unlocks are there. And so we can help each other out. If you give me a release valve and say, hey, if you're one of the people for whom this design doesn't serve its purpose, get rid of it, and then you have a kind of different starting point for the game. I would argue the game is kind of just different a lot of the time if you have the unlock all experience, and that can be really interesting. But it's quite different than just like, how does the player start out this way or that way? I think it's kind of like making the game itself different based on the player's input. A little bit more like an extreme application of build systems. The player kind of does the last little bit of game design themselves. Options for how the game starts. And even having the demo have something different than the actual start of the game if you buy it isn't quite the same thing as that, of course. It's just like your first experience of the game might be this, or you might jump ahead one little step. You might not play the demo, but then you play the beginning. But you can't really have like multiple paths through the game's progression necessarily because of that. To summarize for now then, I would say, yeah, I think the idea of the demo not showing you the very beginning of the game is an interesting idea. Having it be that the game gives you a window into where it's going to go is something I think is pretty cool, though it is fraught with challenges. If you make the player feel powerful, it can feel not great to take that power away. Some people really like this, though. There are lots of game openings that try it, that show the player what the mid game or the end game will be like, and then the player character in universe like powers down or loses their equipment or something. It's certainly been done, and I think you could do such a thing in a demo, or that's kind of similar to this in a demo. So it's interesting, but overall, I also think that it's really attractive to players to have a single unified experience. And I will say my opinion about difficulty modifiers, which is that I think they're often not very good, like kind of weak. It's not necessarily a bad idea to have them, but the implementation is often it's not that it's bad. It's hard to make good difficulty modifiers, I think, like very, very hard. Useful if they were good, but it's hard enough to make them good that I think a lot of the time they don't seem that useful, and they just give the player the option to pick versions of the game that are significantly generally inferior, but maybe make the game work better for a few people. And that's okay, but it would be there's a lot of improvement we could do as an industry. And I think that this is sort of the same way. I think, yes, there are ways to use the demo to kind of give the player a window into the game design, but you can do without that. And I think for a lot of games, there is a sensible default they could just take and be done with it. I don't want to be dismissive. It's cool to make the solution to adapting to the player more elaborate. Love it. Like couldn't like that more. I just think for a lot of games it's unnecessary. How many people does a bland default actually help into a game compared to how many people it pushes away? I'm just putting my flag down on a lot less. Like, it doesn't help that many people. It pushes away way more people than the developer would know. Start with your unique thing. That would be my 2 cents. Or $9. Thank you very much for the Parley, Lordrusty. I've been Zandy. Thanks for watching Parley. If you'd like to get your own, you can do that using a link in the description. For now, I'll look forward to the next one. Perhaps that one I suggested. No pressure. Talk to you next time.